On the morning of the 23rd of May 2024, a notice appeared announcing that the single most famous private home in American music history was scheduled to be sold at a courthouse steps auction in 11 days, seized to satisfy a debt the family says never existed. The home was Graceland. According to the notice, its owner had borrowed nearly $4 million against the property years earlier and never paid it back. And now a company almost nobody had ever heard of intended to take the mansion, the grounds, and everything inside it and sell the whole estate to the highest bidder on the courthouse lawn like a foreclosed used car lot. Local news picked up the story within hours, reporters gathering outside the estate's famous music note gates to ask a question almost nobody expected to still be asking about this particular property in this particular decade. Was Graceland actually about to be sold out from under the family that had spent 40 years rebuilding it? The family fought back within days, arguing in court that the loan documents were fake, the signatures forged, and the lender itself may not have existed in any real sense at all. A Tennessee judge agreed, blocked the sale, and the attempted seizure collapsed within 2 weeks under the weight of its own fabricated paperwork. Graceland was safe. But the sheer fact that anyone could get this close, that a private forgery nearly walked off with the most visited private home in the country in a matter of days, raises a stranger question than it first appears to, because Graceland is not supposed to be vulnerable. It is one of the greatest financial turnaround stories in this entire series, a fortune that was actually genuinely saved, run today as one of the most profitable private home museums on Earth. Every other collapse in this universe happened because nobody ever built the machine that could hold a fortune together. This one did get built, on time, by an unlikely hand, and it worked. So the real question this episode has to answer is not how Graceland almost got stolen in 2024. It is how a fortune that was already fixed once could still, decades later, be standing close enough to the edge that a stranger with a fake piece of paper thought it was worth trying. To understand that, you have to go back to the machine itself, because nobody handed Elvis Presley a fortune either. He grew up poor in Mississippi and Tennessee, and by his late teens he was recording songs in a small Memphis studio that blended the sounds of the gospel, country, and rhythm and blues he had grown up surrounded by into something radio had never quite heard before. Within a few years of his first regional records, he had signed with a major label, and by the mid-1950s, he was the single most explosive commercial phenomenon American entertainment had ever produced. A young man whose face alone could sell out an arena before he sang a single note. The scale of it, once it took off, is difficult to overstate. A single national television appearance could draw an audience covering a majority of the entire country's households at once, something no single performer had ever achieved before him. Records sold in the millions within weeks of release. When the government drafted him into military service in 1958, at the height of his commercial power, it was treated as genuine national news, and the 2 years he spent stationed in Germany did nothing to slow the machine down. If anything, the anticipation built through his absence made the eventual return even more lucrative. Through the 1960s, he shifted heavily into feature films, dozens of them, each one built around a soundtrack that sold nearly as well as the picture itself, a diversified revenue stream running in parallel with his music the entire time. By 1969, he had returned to live performance with a legendary comeback television special, and from 1969 onward, he settled into what would become one of the most consistently profitable live engagements in entertainment history, a standing residency in Las Vegas, supplemented by national and international touring that continued almost without pause for the rest of his life. Records, films, merchandise, television specials, and that permanent, sold-out residency followed across the next 2 decades, an entertainment empire built on the back of one extraordinary talent working at a pace almost nobody else in the industry could sustain, night after night, city after city, for years longer than his own body could comfortably absorb. But there was one flaw built into the very foundation of that empire from nearly the beginning, and it never got fixed for the rest of his life. In the mid-1950s, a manager took over control of Elvis's career, a Carnival-trained promoter who structured his own compensation not as an industry-standard commission, but eventually as a full 50% of Elvis's earnings, an extraordinarily large cut that would have been considered outrageous for almost any other performer of his stature. The manager's own background reads like something out of a different, stranger story entirely. He had built his early career running traveling carnival attractions and promoting country music acts across the South, giving himself a self-invented military-sounding title that had nothing to do with any actual service, and he brought every instinct of that carnival background directly into the management of the biggest musical act in the world, treating Elvis less as an artist to be nurtured than as a single extraordinary attraction to be worked as hard and as continuously as the market would bear. affair. He rarely let outside promoters or studios negotiate directly, inserting himself into nearly every deal, and over time his percentage crept upward from a conventional cut into something far larger, formalized well before anyone around Elvis fully grasped just how much of the singer's own money it was quietly diverting every single year. For roughly 2 decades, every dollar Elvis Presley's talent generated was cut cleanly in half before it ever reached him, a permanent, structural leak built directly into the machine's foundation rather than any accident that happened to it later. It is worth pausing on this, because it is the exact opposite failure mode from most of the fortunes in this series. Those families usually built the machine and then let it fragment or drain away afterward. Here, the machine itself was built with the leak already inside it, present on the very first day of the deal and never once closed for the rest of the singer's life. By August of 1977, Elvis Presley was dead at 42, found unresponsive in a private bathroom at Graceland, the mansion he had purchased in 1957 as a 22-year-old for a sum that seemed almost reckless at the time, and expanded across 2 decades into the sprawling, elaborately decorated estate that would eventually become one of the most recognized private homes in the world. The public shock was immediate and enormous, tens of thousands of mourners gathering outside the gates within hours, but the private reality unfolding inside the estate's finances told a very different story than the scale of that public grief suggested. His will left everything in a trust, structured cleanly around 3 beneficiaries: his father, his grandmother, and his young daughter, with no fragmentation among a crowd of competing heirs the way earlier fortunes in this series were torn apart. On paper, this looked like exactly the kind of clean, concentrated succession this series has praised before. The problem was never who the money was going to. The problem was how little money was actually left by the time it got there. Because the 50% management cut had never stopped, not even after death, the manager continuing to claim a share of the singer's posthumous earnings under the terms of the same old arrangement. Add to that a mansion that, like nearly every white elephant in this series, had never been built to earn a single dollar back, staffed and maintained purely as a private home rather than any kind of business, and the numbers told a brutal story within just a few years. By the start of the 1980s, independent assessments placed the estate's remaining liquid cash somewhere in the low single-digit millions, a staggering collapse for a man whose lifetime earnings had run into the hundreds of millions, with ongoing estate taxes, legal fees, and Graceland's own considerable annual upkeep steadily consuming what little remained. The family that had inherited a legend was closer to inheriting a debt. The father, who had been named executor, died in 1979, only 2 years after his son, and the grandmother followed a year later, leaving the entire trust resting on a single beneficiary, a 12-year-old girl who could not legally control any of it herself. Responsibility for the estate fell to a small group of trustees managing it on her behalf, and one of them was the singer's former wife, a woman in her early 30s with no formal business training, no experience running an estate of this scale, and, by that point, very little time left before the whole thing ran out of cash entirely. Here is where this story splits from nearly every other collapse in this series. She did not simply watch the estate drain away, and she did not try to run it herself out of sentiment or stubborn pride. She made the same decision this series has praised before in very different families, the decision to treat the inheritance as a business rather than a shrine. In 1982, she made the call to open Graceland to the public as a paid tourist attraction, and, critically, she brought in an outside professional with no personal or sentimental attachment to the family at all to actually run the operation day to day, a business executive hired specifically because he understood tourism and management, rather than music or grief. It is the same mechanism that saved Biltmore a generation earlier in this series, the same mechanism that would later help preserve control at the Ford Motor Company, an outsider brought in for competence rather than blood. The gamble worked immediately and then kept working. Visitors arrived by the hundreds of thousands within the first year alone, drawn to see the home exactly as the singer had left it, and the revenue that followed did something almost nothing else touching this estate had ever managed to do. It actually grew. The professional executive she had hired approached the property with none of the sentimentality that might have paralyzed someone raised inside the family's own grief, treating every room, every gift shop opportunity, every licensing possibility as a straightforward business question rather than a sacred relic to be left untouched. Tour packages expanded. Additional attractions were built on adjacent land the estate already controlled. A merchandising and licensing operation grew alongside the physical tourism business, extending the Presley name into products and partnerships that generated income entirely independent of any single ticket sold at the gate. Over the following decade, Graceland transformed from a draining, unsustainable liability into a genuinely profitable enterprise. Ticket sales, merchandise, licensing, and an expanding hospitality operation around the property compounding year over year. The same fundamental logic that had rescued Biltmore a generation earlier in this series, now rescuing a very different kind of American landmark. By the time the daughter turned 25 in 1993 and formally came into control of her own inheritance, the estate that had once been nearly insolvent was valued at roughly $100 million. A recovery this series has rarely, if ever, documented at this scale, and a direct, almost point-for-point rebuttal to every fortune in this universe that collapsed simply because nobody ever tried. That should be the end of the story, and for a while it looked like it was. But a fortune saved once is not automatically a fortune saved forever, and the next chapter of this exact same estate proves it. As an adult, the daughter took increasing control of the business her mother's decision had rebuilt, married several times, pursued her own creative projects, and made her own set of choices, some successful, some considerably less so, including significant personal spending and investment decisions that drew down her own share of the wealth across the years that followed. Reports from that period describe mounting personal debts and increasingly complicated financial arrangements running parallel to the otherwise still thriving tourism business itself, a reminder that the machine and the family drawing income from it are never quite the same thing, and that one can keep running smoothly even while the other quietly struggles. In 2005, she sold the majority of her stake in the operating company, roughly 85% of it, to an outside entertainment investment firm for close to $100 million, while retaining ownership of Graceland itself along with a smaller residual stake in the business. The machine that had been built to run the estate kept running under new ownership, but the family's own financial cushion around it had thinned considerably by the time she herself died suddenly and unexpectedly in January of 2023, at the age of 54. Her own daughter inherited the position of trustee, a young woman now in her 30s, suddenly responsible for the same estate her grandmother had rescued 4 decades earlier, at a moment when the family's internal structure around Graceland was, once again, less settled than it might have appeared from the outside. And it was into exactly that moment of transition, barely a year after a sudden death had reshuffled who actually controlled the trust, that the fraudulent foreclosure notice arrived in the spring of 2024, timed, whether by coincidence or calculation, to a precise window when the estate's defenses were still being reorganized. The scheme itself, once it collapsed under scrutiny, revealed exactly how thin the margin for error still was. The claimed lender's paperwork referenced a deceased individual who court filings suggested may never have actually been involved in any real transaction at all, the loan documents showing inconsistencies serious enough that a judge halted the sale almost immediately once the family's lawyers laid them out in court, including a notary whose signature on the supposed agreement appeared on documents she said she had never actually witnessed or signed at all. It was, by every available account, a bald and clumsy piece of fraud. The kind of scheme that likely would have unraveled eventually under any serious scrutiny, and it nearly worked anyway, not because Graceland's business itself was weak. The operation by 2024 was more profitable than at almost any point in its history, but because the legal and procedural window between an estate's sudden change in leadership and its ability to instantly, forcefully respond to an attack is never as airtight as anyone assumes it to be until someone actually tries to walk through it. That is the real lesson sitting underneath this entire story, and it cuts against the tidy, triumphant version of the Graceland turnaround this episode could have simply ended with a generation ago. A machine built to save a fortune, no matter how well built, is not a permanent fortress that runs itself forever once the founder is gone. It requires someone, in every generation, actively standing in the gap between the estate and whoever might come looking to take it, whether that threat is a 50% management cut baked into the original deal, a mansion nobody ever taught to pay for itself, or a stranger showing up decades later with a forged loan and an 11-day deadline. The family got the harder version of this problem right once already, turning a nearly insolvent estate into one of the great financial recoveries in this series. In 2024, they had to prove they could still do it, on far shorter notice, with far less room for error, and they did. So think back to that courthouse notice posted in the spring of 2024, promising to sell the king of rock and roll's own home out from under his family in 11 days, over a debt that turned out never to have existed at all. The mansion that notice targeted had already survived one near-death experience, drained nearly to nothing within 3 years of its owner's passing by a management deal that took half of everything for 2 decades, and a house that was never built to earn a cent. It survived because someone chose to run it like a business instead of mourning it like a shrine. It survived a second time, decades later, because someone was still paying close enough attention to notice a lie dressed up as a legal document before the 11 days ran out. Compare that to how many other names in this series never got a second chance at all. The Vanderbilts built no machine the first time and never got the opportunity to try twice. The Hughes fortune scattered to 22 cousins with no mechanism standing anywhere in its path. Graceland is the rare exception in this universe that got the hard part right once, watched the danger return in an entirely different form decades later, and got it right again, not because the underlying business had grown invincible, but because somebody was still standing there, paying attention, when the second threat finally arrived. The machine worked. It just turned out that building the machine once was never actually the end of the job. Somebody still has to keep showing up to guard it, generation after generation, threat after threat, for as long as the name on the gate is worth anything to anyone at all.